I want to discuss a little bit more about some visual elements and effects that we can apply to our web pages. I've got our wrapper here, and I could put a border around it, but I'm going to apply something called a border radius. And a border radius is like a border, but it's going to round a border off. And even though I don't have a border, it's still going to round off the corner. So these big white corners here, I'm going to kind of lop off and make them a little rounder. So let's do a 15 pixel border radius and see what that looks like. And you can kind of see they are kind of rounded up here. Let's do a border radius of 50 pixels, something really big. And you can see how round those are. Maybe I'll just add a border so we can see how that looks. But you can see how I've rounded those corners off. Now, I tell most of my students not to go overboard with the border radius. I feel it's one of those effects that kind of, you know, it's like text shadows and border radiuses and big gradients all over the place. They're things that new designers typically try to rely a lot on, and it doesn't really make for good design. And so if you're gonna do a lot of these border radiuses, I typically say no more than 3 to 5. And if I go 3 pixels, you'll see it still looks like a rectangle, but it's just clipped off just enough at the top to kind of just make it a little bit more soft. And so I tend to say, you know, be careful with those. I'll show you what 5 looks like. You know, a little bit more, but not really that noticeable. So let's take off our border here, and we'll just go back to normal. Now, if you are applying those, you can apply like a border bottom left radius and a border bottom right radius and border bottom top. Typically, I find that I use them all. Another thing you can do is you can take an image and make it circular if you wanted to, by taking an image and applying enough of a border radius that it makes it into a circle. Especially if you have a square image, you can kind of mask it, and that's a really nice effect. And that I do like, but typically on buttons or background elements, stuff like that, just kind of ease up on the border radius. Another one you need to really kind of be careful with is one called the box shadow. And the box shadow works just like the text shadow. We can do we're going to go to the right and to the down and down. So think of the X, Y axis. This is on your X axis, and you can do negative if you want to. Okay, and we'll go 5 down, and then we'll say we want to blur out 5 pixels, and we will also go black. Okay, so we're going to take that and apply that there, and you can see how we have that shadow now on the bottom. Now that kind of looks a little hokey. Let's take it and go on the x-axis so it gets shadow on both sides. And then let's take our color, and we're going to use something called an RGBA. Now, an RGBA stands for red, green, and blue. And if you remember, when we're doing hexadecimal, we have the RGB, and we have values from 00 up to FF, and that was essentially 256 different values. Well, when we're talking RGBA, we can use 0 to 255, and if we count 0, that is our 256 characters. So I'm going to take this, and we're gonna make it black. So that's going to be 0, 0, 0, so RGB. And then we have a fourth one that we can add with RGBA, and that stands for the alpha channel, or the amount of opacity or transparency that we want to apply to the object. And maybe I'm going to do something like a 0.2 or something, just enough so it's not a harsh black. And you can kind of see at the bottom of our page now, it kind of makes it feel like a piece of paper sitting on top of that texture. Just a very subtle effect. And most of the time, the best effects are the most subtle effects. And so watch that. Now, we talked about RGBA. And that, you can see the example there, that checkerboard. We are applying that transparency. There's another one we can apply to it. I'm not going to apply it directly to it, but I'll show you how it works. So it's called HSLA. Okay, and the way that works is you have, first off, a hue, the color you're trying to apply. And this is going to be applied on a degree wheel. So if we start with 0 degrees, we're going to be red. and yellow, green, kind of blue, and so forth, okay? I've got a little generator here that kind of makes things a little bit easier. And you can pick the hue over here, and again, think of that color wheel, and it's changing the hue right here, that first digit. And then you're able to choose the saturation level, and we can desaturate it out into a gray, or lots of color, or somewhat. And then we can change the lightness, and that might be really light and white, or really dark and dark. And we can say go there. So we could make it really light, really vibrant, pick some color blue. And last but not least, we can choose the alpha channel, just like we did with RGBA. And you can see this example here of HSLA being generated. We can also see this example here of RGBA. And then last, we can see the hex code, but the hex code will not apply the transparency because it doesn't have the alpha channel. So both ways, HSLA and RGBA are both excellent. Typically in the industry, you'll see RGBA used before you see an HSLA. But HSLA, in my opinion, is a little bit easier as long as you know what the first number stands for on the degree wheel. Then you can kind of look at, oh yeah, that's how much saturation, that's how much light, that's how much opacity, rather than trying to guess the RGBA values in there. This tends to read a little bit easier. So that's kind of how that works. The next thing I wanted to show is the opacity tag. Okay, we're applying an alpha channel to our wrapper around the border, and that's fine. The opacity tag is another thing we can use to apply opacity to an object. And if I apply a 0.5 to our wrapper and I refresh that, you'll see everything got that opacity. So maybe I want that white background to have that opacity, but I don't necessarily want that image. What you have to be careful of is if you are using the opacity declaration, you need to turn it on for some items and turn it off for others. So rather than applying an opacity and trying to get it like our white to show some opacity there, rather than using the opacity tag, it would probably be more beneficial to do an RGBA here, and we'll do white and do a 0.5. That way it applies only to the color and not to the imagery and the text and everything like that. And you can see that 0.5 coming through right now on that opacity. So that's a better approach than using RGBA, or sorry, than using the opacity tag, and you'd want to use RGBA or HSLA instead. Okay, so the next thing I really want to talk about is gradients, and gradients are pretty great. Let me turn this color back here. A gradient is going from one color over to the other, and you can see some examples here of using linear gradients. And if I wanted to apply a linear gradient to this object, maybe we wanted to apply it to that white background. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's take this example here. We'll do this linear gradient, and I'm going to apply it to this right here. Oops. To our background. And you can say color if you want to. And you can see that being applied into it, right? Going from one over to the other. So linear gradients, the way that they work is typically your first value will be your first color and your second. But you may want to actually have that go another direction. And so you can use this turn, and it's just a value. You can see as I change it, that thing turning around the screen there a little bit. I like to use either these to left or to right or something like that, and we could actually do that right here, to left, and you can see that going there, or to top or to bottom or something like that. I also like to use the degrees, and so maybe we want to make it like a 45 degree angle, and so a degree might work a little bit better, but you can see we use the direction and then we use color, so you can see we're using kind of that teal, that yellow, and then on to the orange in this case. And so we're using multiple colors. In this example here, you can see we have this big pattern of all these other colors, and what they're doing with this is really creative, is they're using RGBAs. And if you tell here, you've got a red, no green, no blue, and we're using a 0.8 alpha channel or transparency. And this one's going back to all red and 0%. And so what you can do, if I was to take out these two, well, let's take out this line right here. You can see how I have one color coming down here and another color coming up there at different directions. And so they're taking opacities and they're laying on top of each other to create different color patterns that can kind of fill a screen. It's really a creative way of doing things. But gradients are kind of tricky sometimes. The syntax is a little hard, but that's kind of how you do them. And here's an example of a radial gradient. Radial gradients are going to use circles. So you can see it's going from the center, from one color out to another. This one is starting at the closest side of your color and going out. This one's starting at 100%. Let me move that back to 50% so you can see it going halfway from the screen, so you can tell where you want it to start from. And this one we could say 75%. No, it's not working for us. There's 5%. And these are the color stops, I guess, is what that is. You can see this one is a circle up above and a circle below, going in different directions. Now, if you struggle with this, you might want to look at a CSS gradient generator that's out there. There's lots of these out there. You can kind of go pick one and you can say, okay, I'm going to add a color right here and I want that to be purple, and maybe I want that to have an alpha channel of 0.5 or something. And so you can kind of start layering and choosing and picking different colors, radials, if that be your thing, or what have you. And so just an easier way, and then look down the bottom and it'll kind of give you what the code's going to look like and a fallback color for the background. But sometimes these make it a little bit easier to create these full screen, color backgrounds or things like that, and you can apply them into your CSS, and it just makes it a little bit nicer. But kind of wrap your head around how those gradients work, and then if you do need to use a gradient generator, it'll just save you time than trying to hard code it all from scratch, and you can kind of visualize it as you're building the gradients out. Why are we not doing